So they all stopped. Joab held back the people from pursuing Israel. Isn't that something? God gave them the power through King David, his leader that he was going to have there, to defeat 10 tribes of Israel, their men that had come and followed Absalom. And they took Absalom, cast him into a great pit in the wood, and laid a very great heap of stones upon him, and all Israel fled, everyone to his tent. So everybody in Israel just took off and got out of there. They were done. The war was over. The uprising was done, and now we just need to mend things up. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and reared up for himself a pillar, which is in the king's dale. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. And he called the pillar after his own name, and it is called unto this day Absalom's place. Now, do you ever read that and you wonder, what does it mean? He had no son. Let's see, I think, look at 2 Samuel 14. 2 Samuel 14. So did he not have any sons? He reared up a pillar because he had no son. He had no son at least to put on the throne at this point in time. What did I say, 14? And what?
27.
27, thank you. And unto Absalom there were born 3 sons and 1 daughter whose name was Tamar. She was a woman of a fair countenance. And Tamar, of course, is the one that Amnon raped, and then Absalom 2 years later killed him. And that was David's grief, because a grandson of his now was dead because of Absalom doing that. But anyway, and so Absalom fled at that time. Then he was brought back to Jerusalem and put back in where he could visit people and could steal the hearts of the people, so to speak. But you see that he had 3 sons. There were born 3 sons and 1 daughter. Now we hear more about the daughter, but we never hear anything about the sons. And we don't see here that the sons, they either had died or was whatever happened to them. Obviously they're not around, because at this point in time he reared, well, remember, 40 years has gone by. 40 years since Absalom had those sons. And so he had, who knows what happened to him, but he'd reared up this pillar of himself because he didn't have anybody to take his place. So even if he became the king, he had no heritage to follow him. Okay, back to chapter 18. He reared up a pillar in verse 18 there, which is in King's Dale. I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. And he called the pillar after his own name. It is called unto this day Absalom's place. Then said Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, of course that was the priest, let me now run and bear the king tidings, how that the Lord hath avenged him of his enemies. And Joab said unto him, he said unto Ahimaaz, thou shalt not bear tidings this day, but thou shalt bear tidings another day. But this day thou shalt bear no tidings, because the king's son is dead. And so he didn't want the young man Ahimaaz to go back and tell David the news. He knew how David was going to take the news of Absalom, his son, being killed. So then said Joab to Cushai. This Cushai was the messenger, the normal messenger of the field there. Go tell the king what thou hast seen. It's interesting that he says, go tell him what you've seen. In other words, he hadn't seen everything. He didn't know everything about it, but go tell him anyway what you have seen. And Cushai bowed himself unto Joab and ran. Then said Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, yet again to Joab, but howsoever, let me, I pray thee, also run after Cushai. And Joab said, Wherefore wilt thou run, my son, seeing that thou hast no tidings ready? He says, you don't know what to say to the king. You know what? Why should you run? I've sent the runner that knows what he's talking about and what he's supposed to say. Verse 23, but howsoever said he, let me run. And he said unto him, run. Okay, just if you want to run, just go for a run. Have fun, you know. Then Ahimaaz ran over by the way of the plain and overran Cushai. So he actually got ahead of Cushai. And David sat between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof over the gate and under the wall, and lifted up his eyes, looked, and behold, a man running alone. And the watchman cried and told the king. The king said, if he be alone, there is tidings in his mouth. And he came apace and drew near. And the watchman saw another man running. And the watchman called unto the porter and said, behold, another man running alone. And the king said, he also bringeth tidings. And the watchman said, methinketh the running of the foremost is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. And the king said, he is a good man and cometh with good tidings. Remember that when the king went into exile, he was the son of Zadok. Ahimaaz was the one that came and went with all the news. He was the spy in Jerusalem that's got the message to David about what was going on with Absalom and his kingship there. And so they kept going back and forth here. Now, verse 28 says, and Ahimaaz called and said unto the king, all is well. And he fell down to the earth upon his face before the king and says, blessed be the Lord of thy God, which hath delivered up the men that lifted up their hand against my lord the king. And so he's saying, your army beat their army, okay? So then the king said in verse 29, is the young man Absalom safe? And Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servant and me, thy servant, see, that he was David's servant actually. Joab had his army servant, Cushai. So I saw a great tumult, but I knew not what it was. And so, see, what did he see? Well, he saw a great tumult. That's all he knew. And then he heard, of course, Joab stop everybody and say the war's over and so forth. And the king said unto him, turn aside and stand here. And he turned aside and stood still. Now, Joab, again, I don't think wanted David, the son of the priest, there to go and have the news of his son being killed. And he hadn't seen that and didn't know, so he went to tell him what he'd seen, which was, didn't tell him anything about Absalom. But Cushai, he was there and he knew what to say, what he was supposed to do. Verse 31, behold, Cushai came. Cushai said, tidings, my lord the king, for the Lord hath avenged thee this day of all them that rose up against thee. And the king said unto Cushai, is the young man Absalom safe? And Cushai answered, the enemies of my lord the king, and all that rise against thee to do thee hurt, be as that young man is. So that's telling David what he didn't want to know. His son and all the rebellion is over. And the king was much moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, thus he said, O my son, Absalom, my son, Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son. So he's weeping for Absalom. He didn't want anything to happen to Absalom. Oftentimes we see people that have a rebellious son, something like that, that's trying to destroy them, and yet they'll do anything in their life to try to redeem that son or that daughter or whatever it is that they're working at their child, to no avail. And of course here, this was the thing that God had allowed. This was what God had directed to be so, and it was. Now, this disobedience by Joab and raising his hand is remembered by David when the kingdom changes hands to Solomon. And so let's look at that in closing here. 1 Kings chapter 2. Just a few pages to your right. 1 Kings chapter 2. And David's given instructions to Solomon now as Solomon takes over the kingship, the leadership of Israel, Judah. And so in 1 Kings 2, verse 5, 1 Kings 2:5, he's telling him what to do as he's on the throne of Israel. In verse 4, now verse 5, moreover, thou knowest also what Joab, the son of Zeruiah, did to me. What did he do to him? He took Absalom, killed Absalom. And then he mentions some other things here, and what he did to the two captains of the hosts of Israel, unto Abner the son of Ner, and unto Amasa the son of Jether, whom he slew, and shed the blood of war in peace. So Joab had no right, after peace was already had, the peace treaty was signed, the hands had been shaken, the kings had shaken hands with Amasa and with Abner in these cases, and Joab knew very plainly that the king had made peace with them, and yet he connived to kill them. And so he's telling Solomon now, and so you know all these things, and how he did these things in peacetime. He had no right to kill these people that I had given amnesty to, that I had made peace with. In fact, David, we'll see next hour probably that David even made Amasa his captain in place of Joab at this point to bring the kingdom back together, because he was now the leader of all the exiled group, all of Absalom's troops. All of Absalom's had gathered together of all Israel. Amasa was the captain that was left. And so he's the man, David thought, that we can get along, and I have no problem with him, David says, and he got with him, and they made an arrangement, and David put him in charge of all Israel armies. Well, that was a good thought, but Joab didn't like it. And it didn't last very long. But we'll be looking more at that here in a little bit. And so we see that he tells, let's finish that verse in verse 5 of 1 Kings 2. And so he did all these things. He shed the blood of war in peace, and put the blood of war upon his girdle that was about his loins, and in his shoes that were on his feet. So all these things he did. And then he tells Solomon in verse 6, do therefore according to thy wisdom, let not his hoar head go down to the grave in peace. So he's saying, yes, take my nephews and destroy them as it should be right. And David, how many times would have done that? But probably David was somewhat afraid of them, because they were the mighty men, and he against those two young guys, they were his nephews, remember, he probably wouldn't have had a chance with them, and they'd have probably killed him. So that's the way it is. That's war, father-son battle here, and it ended with the son dead, and it ended with the father in grief, and the father had a hard time getting over it, even though Absalom was a thorn in his side and in his flesh and his family for his whole kingdom time, starting way back with when Absalom killed his grandson, David's grandson. Okay, let's stop there, then we'll continue on in a few minutes. Pray that my voice will come back. Okay, Lord be with you. Fellowship.